The stories contained in this podcast are the recollections of the guests we've invited onto the show. We are merely an outlet for people to share their truths, and we accept no legal responsibility for the stories contained herein.
I'm Kendra Sheets.
And I'm Rich Gill.
And this is Enough, a podcast which aims to shine light into the darkened corners of the music industry while discussing the ways we can and should improve ourselves and, in turn, our community.
Welcome to another episode of Enough. I'm your co-host, Kendra Sheets.
And I am your other co-host, Rich Gill.
And thank you for joining us for another edition of Subtext. Today, we're discussing the media spectacle that was the Johnny Depp versus Amber Heard defamation trial. By the time this comes out, it will have been just over 1 month since the jury decided to side with Depp. And while both parties were awarded millions of dollars for various number of reasons, ultimately Johnny Depp came out both financially and publicly ahead.
To start off with, let's summarize the backstory for those of you who may know about the case. And let's be honest, I think all of us know at least a little bit about it, but may not know how exactly it came to be. Everyone knows who Johnny Depp is. He's been both a household name and a favorite actor of outcasts and scarf aficionados for years and years, with memorable characters such as Edward Scissorhands, Sweeney Todd, Jack Sparrow, Crybaby's Wade Walker, and many more. He's also a pretty terrible wannabe musician who is still performing with a band called the Hollywood Vampires, which interestingly enough is named after an infamous drinking club from the 70s, which included a mixed bag of drug addicts, alcoholics, and domestic abusers like Harry Nilsson, John Lennon, Keith Moon, and Alice Cooper in its membership. Depp has had a history of drinking and drugs, and the masses have always thought that was sexy, even when he was spiraling out and hitting rock bottom both physically and financially in the 2010s. Amber Heard, by comparison, is barely a household name. She's 20 years his junior. She got her first major role in 2008's Pineapple Express, and her career was on the rise when she was cast in her biggest role to date, the 2017 DC Extended Universe film Aquaman, also cast in the sequel to Aquaman. The two met in 2009, got together 3 years later, got married in 2015, and Heard filed for divorce a year later. 4 days after that, she filed a request for a restraining order on the grounds of domestic violence.
Now, there's a whole lot of legalities and nuances that we're skipping over here for time's sake. We could talk about this for a few hours. There's a lot here, such as the exchange of millions in reparations between the two that we're not going to get into. But you should really read all about this, as every piece of this, even the stuff we're glossing over today, exemplifies what a strange case this is in its entirety. The first wave of accusations from Heard about Depp came in 2016. This was before the election of Trump and more than a year before the multiple accusations against Harvey Weinstein pummeled the public's collective consciousness. So it's safe to say that all of this was shrugged off. The public who listened and who even cared sided with Depp. He'd keep working, and Heard probably wouldn't, because that's just how it was in Hollywood. Until it wasn't. Post-Weinstein, once Me Too was in full swing, the fact that Johnny Depp's ex-wife felt the need to get a restraining order against him suddenly became very powerful and worth a revisit.
In December 2018, Amber Heard wrote an op-ed piece which was published in the Washington Post, which was headlined, quote, "I spoke up against sexual violence and faced our culture's wrath. That has to change," end quote. And this is why she was sued. Heard never mentions Depp by name, but him and his counsel argue that this is an implication that he abused Amber Heard over the course of their relationship. 3 months later, in March 2019, Depp filed a defamation lawsuit against her seeking $50 million. That is the trial that has just concluded. In January 2021, Heard countersued for $100 million. This trial will likely go to court later this year, also in Virginia. So they, and by default, all of us collectively as a society, get to go through this whole thing again.
And what's bizarre about this Depp defamation suit is that it's almost like a do-over, as Depp sued the executive editor and a publisher of the British tabloid The Sun in 2018 for libel, after it referred to him as a quote-unquote wife beater. That went to trial in London in 2020, and the burden was on the paper to show that its statements were correct and they won. In that trial, Heard detailed 14 instances in which Johnny Depp abused her. Soon after, Depp announced that he had been asked to resign from the Fantastic Beasts franchise. But because that case was against the Sun and not Heard, this suit that we're speaking of today was able to continue in Virginia. God bless America, am I right? Okay, so we are all caught up on the trial itself.
Now, let's get into all the details that turned this case into the perfect shitstorm against the Me Too movement and against survivors. Let's start with their celebrity status. This is a twofold issue. First, Depp's fan base is hugely vast and tremendously powerful. It's also made up of people who are deeply emotionally invested in him and therefore willing to jump on any ambiguities in this case as proof of his innocence. If you watched Surviving R. Kelly or are familiar with the case, this behavior can be seen there as well. Also, in the recently released Phoenix Rising documentary that Evan Rachel Wood did about Marilyn Manson. You saw it with O.J. Simpson, with Michael Jackson, and with so many celebrity cases. Fans believe that their status somehow supersedes their actions. And to bring it back to music, we've seen our fair share of it too. Elvis Presley, David Bowie, Jesse Lacey of Brand New, Maynard James Keenan of Tool, and basically the entire roster of Burger Records. There's just something about the power dynamic between musicians and their fans, which makes the fans give them a pass for any behavior, which is dangerous.
And now it is time to go off on a patented Kendra true crime tangent.
Woo!
So, deep into quarantine, I was going into a very deep 90s crime doc wormhole, and I noticed a pattern. And it's something that I thought of while watching what I did of these proceedings. I wasn't able to watch everything. It was too much for me to handle, but I watched bits and pieces of the Depp v. Heard trial. And this is what I noticed. In the 90s, in these cases, specifically like OJ, the Menendez brothers, there's always someone in these documentaries that talks about how court TV or the like was allowed inside the courtroom. Before the 90s, it wasn't really common to have television stations in the trial. You had reporters, but not stations actually recording everything that was going on. But as the trials and deliberations began to gain public popularity, cameras then made their way into the courtroom. And there's solid evidence that being filmed and knowing that you're being filmed made those in the room act differently. It made the case into what is like a public performance. Lawyers who are once tame are suddenly shouting and boisterous. Defendants are smirking and laughing and looking howdy. And just like in those trials, and so many since then, the Depp v. Heard trial was raked over the coals of public opinion.
Heard's every gesture has been analyzed and scrutinized. I saw a TikTok video going frame by frame, claiming that her wiping her nose at one point was her snorting cocaine in the courtroom, which is ludicrous and ridiculous to anyone who knows what doing cocaine is like. And yet everyone is seemingly silent when it comes to Depp's behavior. He smiled, he grinned, he laughed, he shook his head and rolled his eyes behind his oh-so-cool blue-tinted sunglasses. Depending on what you believe, Depp is either an abuser or a victim of abuse. But in court, his actions throughout remained casual and even cheerful. Court TV, which broadcast the trial, doubled its daytime ratings. Hashtags associated with the trial and those involved trended all over social media. On Reddit, Twitter, and the beloved TikTok, people are loudly declaring their support for Depp and that surely Heard is a liar. There's a good amount of social media content which slammed Heard, which was reportedly paid for by conservative websites. There were even 340 Twitter accounts which were devoted to defaming Heard and amplifying petitions calling for her to be fired from acting and modeling jobs. A psychiatrist who testified on behalf of Heard is facing a campaign of negative online reviews meant to sabotage her career. There was even a TikTok that went viral in which a woman addresses Heard and says, quote, "He could have killed you. He had every right," end quote. And let's put this into perspective again. She was on trial not for violence, but for penning a column which ran in a newspaper in which she never once names her abuser.
And the commentary that filled the internet is in complete contrast with the evidence that was actually being presented day in and day out in the court. Fans touted justice for Johnny hashtags, while Heard presented more than a dozen experiences of violence, which Depp referred to as either insane or all false. Depp described himself as, quote, a Southern gentleman who had respect for women, end quote. Yet there's evidence that he called Heard a, quote unquote, worthless hooker. He joked about wanting to, quote, smack the ugly cunt around, end quote, and burning and raping her dead body. The trial also revealed that Depp spent a lot of time with Marilyn Manson, who we all know, as Rich had mentioned, has been accused of rape by numerous women and is suing his ex, Evan Rachel Wood, for defamation after she named him as her abuser in early 2021. While it's been nothing short of an uphill struggle to get people to listen to the story of survivors over the years, it's like suddenly the masses seem interested in domestic violence. But only because there's a chance that a scorned and vengeful woman might be lying about it. For those who think that the Me Too movement went too far, siding with Depp is a chance to position their support for male abuse victims rather than a reactionary, misogynistic fury. Mel magazine reported that in the so-called manosphere, and that's in quotes, where men's rights activists expound on the evils of feminism, Depp has become a hero. Quote, his trial fits neatly into a tapestry of claims that men are under attack, woven alongside clumsy narratives about false rape accusations and mothers lying to block children from their fathers, end quote. He also cited comments in which the supporters bemoan our culture's, quote, disproportional focus on female suffering, end quote, and call for the destruction of the, quote, the believe all women with no evidence narrative, end quote. Being wrongfully accused of rape rarely ever happens. We've discussed this before. Innocent men rarely get accused of abuse. But the Depp case could give the public more reason to believe that that is not the case.
While this case is, of course, between Heard and Depp, it also reveals quite a lot about the communal us. Why are we, a supposedly progressive first world nation, obsessed with misogynistic tropes? How did, quote, believe women turn into inspecting their every breath for falsehood? Why do we refuse to understand complexities and ambiguities and fall back on black and white thinking? Without a doubt, there was clearly toxic behavior and abuse on both sides of this relationship. But mutual abuse doesn't exist, as both parties don't normally just decide to hash it out at the exact same time. Someone is the primary aggressor, and the other party fights back in self-defense. This is a story without a hero, and we refuse to accept that. This trial has now set a precedent via its case law that speaking out against abusers can result in punishment even if the abuser is not named. This kind of voyeuristic, sensationalistic, celebrity treatment further normalizes abuse and undermines victims of intimate partner violence, especially those who happen to be women, and especially those who disproportionately are women of color, women below the poverty line, and people in the LGBTQ plus community.
And I would like to take a moment to kind of pan out from this topic and tie in the subject of our last Subtext episode, the overturning of Roe v. Wade. Since we recorded that episode, the SCOTUS has officially openly overturned the landmark ruling that was upheld for 50 years with a 6-3 vote. And within mere hours, I don't know if I want to call him Justice Thomas, so we'll just say Clarence Thomas, stated that rulings regarding granting gay rights and accessible and legal contraception should also be reconsidered now that Roe is overturned. But it was never just about Roe. The overturning of Roe v. Wade, while on the conservative agenda, now serves as its own form of case law, which could possibly open the door for the removal of other rights that have been rightfully solidified over decades. This opens the door to stripping people of their autonomy.
Earlier in this episode, it was mentioned that conservative websites paid for negative content slamming Amber Heard. Why would they do that? What would they gain? It's all part of the bigger picture. This trial was perfectly set up for the discrediting of an abuse survivor, and in doing so, helped damage the Me Too movement. Why would they want to do that? Well, Clarence Thomas and Brett Kavanaugh have both been accused of misconduct by multiple women. We talked about the Kavanaugh trial on here before. We all saw that fucking circus of ridiculousness. Around 30 women have accused the 45th president of sexually assaulting them. He spoke openly about grabbing women by the pussy. And while we may try to convince ourselves that this was just locker room talk, that would mean that when Depp referred to Amber Heard as, quote, the slippery whore that I donated my jizz to for a while, end quote, is also such. If that's the case, burn down the fucking locker room, burn down the fucking school.
The verdict of the Depp v. Heard case, like the overturning of Roe v. Wade, is the ultimate removal of autonomy. Both are huge steps backwards in a country that is seemingly careening back to the early 1900s. It sets a precedent which will not only silence victims, but also removes the right to free speech. News outlets are allowed to blast falsities, which are easily proven as such. But a woman is now not allowed to pen an article which described a life experience without so much as naming her abuser. The SCOTUS also recently barred lawsuits against cops who gather evidence without advising people of their rights. Miranda. They have also removed the assurance of safe abortions, but approved the allowance of open carry for self-defense. These choices are setting certain sex as a second-class citizenship. It's the destructive absolute mentality that we talked about earlier, which pits people against each other. We can no longer trust those who were placed in power to protect us and our best interests. We must learn how to be our own advocates now, how to be self-sufficient. While they may be placing the rules in our bodies, it's now our job to study all aspects of those rules so we can learn how to manipulate them or circumvent them to our benefit.
Let's wrap this up with an excerpt from the statement Amber Heard made after the verdict, which summarizes both the tone of the trial and also the state of the country at this time. Quote, I'm heartbroken that the mountain of evidence still was not enough to stand up to the disproportionate power, influence, and sway of my ex-husband. I'm even more disappointed with what this verdict means for other women. It is a setback. It sets back the clock to a time when a woman who spoke up and spoke out could be publicly shamed and humiliated. It sets back the idea that violence against women is to be taken seriously. End quote. Enough is a podcast centering on abuse, harassment, and assault in the music scene. To help get the word out, please like or subscribe and share with your friends. If you have been on the receiving end of harm from someone, be it artist, venue owner, audience member, or someone else, and would like to share your story on a future episode, please reach out to us at thisisenoughpodcast@gmail.com. All correspondences are kept confidential.